This is my side, my story. My name is Mary Spirer. It was Mary Richmond until I married Oscar Spirer. My grandparents came from St. Petersburg, which is Leningrad now. His name was Sidney, and my grandmother's name was Deborah. My father also had been born in Leningrad. His father was Simon Richmond, and his mother, oh God, was Gittel. That's a Jewish name for Gertrude. Both families knew each other in Leningrad. My father married a woman by the name of Minnie, and I don't know what her name was, her maiden name was, when he was 18, because her father was very anxious for them to get married, since they lived in a town where there were many Polish people, and he was afraid that she would get in trouble with one of the young men there. So he told my father that asked to marry her, and that he would pay for their passage to the United States, which my father agreed upon. I forgot to mention that the reason that they lived in Petrograd was because both my grandfathers were artisans of one kind or another. My mother's father was a tinsmith, and he made all the copper pots and kettles for the kitchens of the Tsar. My father's father was a tailor, and he helped make the uniforms for the royal family. And so in this small ghetto where the Jews lived and were permitted to live in the city of Christians, it was only those who were in some way affiliated with the palace who were permitted to live there and have their families there. Thus, my mother's sister and she went to what they call the gymnasium, and my mother was graduated there. It was the high school, and for many years, in the hall leading to our kitchen, hung her diploma, and I really don't know what happened to it. She was so proud of it. But anyway, my father left Petrograd when he was 14 and was sent to an uncle who lived down in South Russia, maybe Georgia, because he would have been conscripted into the army. Not conscripted, what's the word? Conscripted into the army, and the army for Jews was just disastrous. They did all sorts of dreadful things to these young boys who were there. And so my grandfather didn't want that to happen to my father, so he sent him to a part of Russia that had no conscription at that time for such young boys. Anyway, he lived there with his cousin until he met Minnie and received the invitation from her father to go to America and live there so that she would not get in trouble in Russia. It was always a standing joke in our family. However, they did get to America, but in 1898, they came to the United States. And she had a little girl whose name was Lucille. Minnie had the little girl, as my father's first wife. And after about a year and a half, she ran off with a streetcar conductor and left the baby to be taken care of with her next door neighbor, so that when my father came home from work, he was given the good news that his wife was gone, but his baby was safe and sound next door. He immediately took the baby and went down. There were no telephones then. At least they didn't have any. There were telephones. He took the baby down to my grandmother on the Lower East Side and asked her to take care of her. And he went for a year looking for his wife, and finally found her in Detroit, and they were divorced. And he came back to New York City, and after a year he married my mother. I think I ought to tell you about the time of when I was growing up. I have been very fortunate in as much as I have lived through a generation where practically everything that I knew has either vanished, but certainly has improved. There were no streetcars except those that were drawn by horses when I was a little girl. The music was made by singers and the Victrola. There was no radio, there was no television, there was no refrigerator. We had an ice box, and every Friday the man would come and fill it up with a big cake of ice. There was no electricity when I was little. There were gas lights. They were gauze bulbs put into fixtures, and we lit them. We didn't, but my parents did, when it got dark. And the fixtures were pretty, but it was not electricity. I think it was about, well, they still had that when I got married. There were some houses that had it, but the electricity was there when I was growing up, maybe around 14 or 15. The telephones were several people on one line, and then you had to crank them in order to get the operator. We had gas stoves, and of course there were wood stoves too in some houses. But we lived in houses that had gas, and they were funny stoves, I can tell you, because I remember them. They had feet. They were probably about 2 feet tall, and they stood on a parcel of the kitchen floor that had been tiled. And under that, every night, my mother would clean all our white shoes. We always wore white shoes. And she would clean them, and in the morning when we came down, all the shoes were waiting for us. Every morning we would come down to put on our shoes. We were all dressed upstairs. We lived in a house, and the sleeping rooms were upstairs, so we would get dressed up there. There was a maid or two sometimes with my mother to help us all get dressed. We were very close in age. And then we would come trotting down the steps, and we would have our cereal at this big marble table in the kitchen. And every morning my brother Lenny's shoes were put on, and every morning he would cry when they were laced, that there was something in his shoe. And every morning my mother took the shoe off and put her hand in to show him there was nothing in the shoe, and that if he ever did it again, he was going to get punished. Well, he continued that constantly, until one day he was crying again, there was something in his shoe. So my mother put her hand in and came out with a dead mouse. With that, she threw the mouse, and we were all sitting eating our porridge. And of course, she jumped on the table. Where else was she to go? So we all jumped with her. Now, if you can figure out how 4 children, Milton was only a little baby then. 4 children, my mother standing on the table, screaming. The children didn't know what she was screaming about, only that she threw something. But it probably was so horrible to her that she had a mouse in her hand that I'll never forget it as long as I live. It'll live in my memory constantly. And I am frightened of mice to this very day. Just looking at them makes me remember my mother jumping on the table into our cereal bowls. We were a mess that morning, I need not say more. My mother and father married in 1905. Mother was a designer of women's clothes and father ran the manufacturing and selling end. We lived on 5th Avenue and 14th Street, a large apartment house which is no longer there. The factory was on 14th Street and 5th Avenue. It's altogether different today than it had been in those years. I was born in my grandmother's apartment on Rivington Street, the Lower East Side. Mother had a little boy baby when I was 2. There was a nursemaid, and Mother would drop in many times a day to see what was happening with her offspring. Unfortunately, Sydney died of spinal meningitis at the age of 1.5 years. Mother never worked after that, although she did draw and design women's clothes at home for my father and his business. When I was 4, my sister Gertrude was born, and 15 months later Evelyn was born. My father bought a house in Brooklyn where I lived until I was married. Leonard was born a year after Evelyn and Milton 2 years after Leonard. My mother became ill soon after that and died when Milton was 5.5 years old, and I was 14. From a wonderful, happy childhood, and it certainly was wonderful, I had love and affection and caring, and I can't believe that any child would ever have had more to remember than I have of that time of my life. It seemed to me that everybody that I knew loved me, and that, of course, was just wonderful. My father was very distressed when my mother died. He was left with a household of small children, none of them capable of handling it themselves, and she was also part of his life, not only his love life and family life, but his business life, because she did all of his drawings and stylings. I'm thinking now that that's what it is, because I don't really remember clearly, but I do remember her sketching all the time. Anyway, he worked, as they call, a workaholic today. He came home very late at night and left very early in the morning, and the only time we did see him was on Saturday afternoons and Sundays. I was always his favorite from the time I was born, I guess. And so whatever affection he had had before was twice as much after my mother died. He couldn't buy me enough things. When I was 16, I had a beautiful squirrel coat on my bed for my birthday present. I had charge accounts in Saks 34th Street and bought anything I wanted. And they were always very expensive because I thought my father was very rich. Maybe he was, I don't know. Well, of course, riches today compared to what they were then are altogether different. But anything that I could have wanted, I could have had. He was very generous, and his love for me went on until he died. He used to come to visit when we lived in New York, and he was quite ill, but he would put on a pair of pajamas, a pair of pants over his pajamas and his suit jacket, and would stop at a bakery and buy stuff. We lived in New York then. He still lived in the same house, but I was always the apple of his eye. And he would come every week, and sometimes twice a week, from Brooklyn to New York on the subway, sick as he was, with a bundle of rolls and fresh rye bread. And I would say to him, "Papa, we have bakeries here, but nobody brings them to you, do they?" He would say to me. I said, "No, but thank you very much. It's too heavy for you to carry. Nothing is too much for me to carry to you." He was a very loving man, and he was very grateful to me for giving him grandchildren. He was especially crazy about Peter, and I must tell you a story about that. I brought the children to see him, and we brought him records. He loved music, and so did my mother. They always went to plays and theaters and the opera when it was in season. We brought him records for his birthday, album of some opera and some Tchaikovsky, whom he loved. And we spent the afternoon with him. And then he put Peter on his lap and started to kiss his neck and his cheeks. And Peter must have been about 6 then. And he said to my father, "Grandpa, how old are you really today?" And I guess my father was 60 because he died at 66. So Papa said 60. So Peter said, "Oh no, you can't be 60. Very seriously. And my father was so pleased that Peter didn't think he was 60. And he said to Peter, "How old do you think I am?" "Oh, 100, said Peter. My father pushed him off his lap so fast I thought the kid was going to fall. And I said, "Papa," he said, "how could he think I'm 100? So Peter pipes up and says, "You have so many wrinkles, Grandpa." And that's what I remember about Peter and my father, aside from all the wonderful love that he got from him. My father married when I was 17. And he married a very lovely lady who had 2 daughters. As a matter of fact, because of one of the daughters whom I was very friendly with, I met her mother and I introduced my father to her. And they eventually married, maybe about a year after that or 6 months after. And she moved into the house. And then my life became suddenly totally different than it had ever been before. I was down 3rd place then. I had my 2 friends were older, and they weren't older, but their mother was the ruler of the roost then. And they came. I had my own bedroom, and my father had a new bedroom furniture put in, and they slept in one bed, and I slept in my bed. And he would come in every evening to say goodnight. That's when he had to stop working. He wasn't feeling too well. And he would speak to the girls, and he would kiss them goodnight and walk out. Well, that infuriated me. I need not tell you how upset and angry it made me. And this went on for quite some time. Another thing happened that I used to get, and in those days it was a lot, $10 a week for money for school. I could do whatever I wanted with it. And if I needed more, I always got it. But my stepmother decided that was much too much money for a young girl, and that $5 was enough for me to buy lunches in school and fare, and I really didn't need more than that since I got everything else at home. So my father reduced the amount of money to $5. And then I noticed too that she was wearing some of my mother's jewelry, and that made me even more furious. So one day I decided to have it out with my father, and after a big fuss, I called one of my friends and asked her whether I could come and stay with her for a while until I found some lodging. And Oscar, who was one of my boyfriends then, I called him and asked him to take me to Addie's house, and he did. He came. He was always there whenever I needed him. And he took me to my friend's house, and I stayed there for a few weeks. And then I found a lady whom I knew before she was married, and her husband had died. And she was living alone with a little girl, and I asked her whether I could share her apartment. And she said yes, she would be glad to have company. And so I moved in with her. I believe it must have been May or June, and I was to graduate that term from high school. And I had to get a job because I had no money. I wasn't going to ask my father for any, because I didn't talk to him. So I moved in with Marion, and I quit school. It must have been June, before graduation. And I lived with her for about 3 years, and then I married Oscar. I was almost 21 then, and he was 23. And it was the beginning of, or I should say, a continuation of a long love affair that I had with my father. And he brought all the things that I had been missing in the last few years of that period of my life. He loved me dearly. He was devoted, he was kind, he was generous, and we had fun together. What I can't get over, and if I'm shedding a few tears, you'll forgive me, that during so many things that happened that should have made me a very sullen and unhappy person, I never was. And sometimes I look back when I'm alone and in bed and think, how can I have such a sense of humor? Everybody notices it. Everybody's aware of it. And I always find things funny. People doing funny things. My friends saying funny things. And sometimes I saying funny things. And all these things seem to dispel whatever unhappiness or whatever thoughts I might have that are difficult to accept. And I keep going on, like a wound-up toy that has to make people laugh. Anyway, Os and I were married, and we had 11 months, and our baby was born, and that's Chick. She was named Audrey Minna, after my mother and my aunt. And when she was very little, I had a German nurse, and she used to call her Poopy. So we call her Poopy, which is doll in German or something like that, Poopy or something. I didn't tell you about Oscar's family. Os had a lovely, lovely mother, very well educated, and a hard-working man for a father. My mother-in-law was very charming, very well educated, well-read, extremely devoted to a daughter who had a bad hip ailment. There were 4 children. Flora, who was the eldest, and married a musician, a pianist, by the name of David Holland, and he had 1 child, Noel. And Peter and Noel were very good friends for very, very many years. Then there was George. George had 2 children. One was Patsy, who lives in California, and the other was Billy, who unfortunately, about 20 years ago, lived in New York and went down at 12 o'clock at night to buy a Sunday paper and was stabbed to death by two foreigners for no reason at all. And he died the next day. Anyway, then there was Evelyn. Evelyn fell down when she was about 5 years old and injured her hip, and it never healed properly. So that finally she was sent to Switzerland, to a very elegant clinic there where they did not believe in medication, but that the sun would heal all these illnesses. And she lived there until, she must have been about 18 when she came back to the States. But my mother-in-law went every 3 months and stayed for 3 months and came back and lived here for 3 months. But her life was with Evelyn. The other children grew up. Nice children and good children. George was a, what would you call a bon vivant? Is that what it is? He knew everything about music. He knew everything about the theater. He was involved in anything that was going on. You could count on George being part of whatever it was. He was a charming man, and Oscar, I really never knew him as a man until I married him. He was always a young boy. He loved music, played the violin beautifully, and he and I used to concertize quite frequently, especially at parties. We were very, very much in demand. It was free. And when Papa died, I would tell you that of all the mourners there, in those days, you went to visit the funeral parlor the day before or the night before. Minnie leaned over that coffin and begged his pardon in a voice that you could hear 4 blocks away, sorry and crying her heart out for what she did, and to have him excuse her, sound asleep and dead. But I guess all the things she could never say to him while he was alive, she said then. And if anybody ever mourned my father, it was Minnie that day. I'll never forget it as long as I lived. And I was angry at it, because here were we who loved him so much and couldn't cry like that. Oh, I met Grandpa, strangely enough, at a birthday party. I was 16 years old, that was given for my future stepmother's daughter, whom I was friends with. And I met him and his friend, and I didn't know which one I liked better, and they were both excessively possessive of me. And it might sound very egotistic or immodest, but I was a pretty girl. And as I told you before, I had a lot of life in me. Played the piano, I sang, I danced, I told jokes, and everybody was happy when I was there. And they both decided that I was their girl. His name was Rex Auslander. And he was very good friends with Oscar. But Oscar, in somehow or some way, must have told him that if he steps on that property, he's going to get it. And so I didn't see Rex as a boyfriend after the first time. But I did see Oscar, who was always there. Even though I went out with other boys and other men, he was always on the porch, on my porch, waiting for me to come home, so I could never kiss anybody goodnight. he was very possessive. I used to see that cigarette burning, the glow of the cigarette on the porch, and I thought to myself, oh my God, I'll never be able to kiss this guy, and I like him so much. Because I had a visitor. And as soon as he said goodnight to me and left, Oscar would pick himself up, and I would say to him, you know I have to be in the house by 12 o'clock, which was a strict rule. You better go before my father catches you. And so he would leave. But he was always there. I remember when I was 18, I was asked to go to a ball. At those days, they used to call them balls. Now they call them banquets. And I wasn't living home. And although I had a very pretty dress, I really didn't have a nice coat to wear. And Oscar went to one of the customers and borrowed a mink coat, and I wore that. Can you believe that? It's hard to believe, doesn't it? Sound difficult. But I did wear it. And he returned it the next day. I guess he told them the customer didn't like the coat, although the customer did like the coat very much. But he was so loving all the time and so giving that I couldn't help love him. He was always there. No matter how many boyfriends I had, he was always there. I never could get rid of him. And I don't think I ever wanted to get rid of him. Although sometimes I used to hope that I would get rid of him. But then I was 16, 17, 18, 19. And then, when he asked me to marry him, he said to me, we can't get married until my sister and my brother get married. My mother won't hear of such a thing. Now, his sister was about 5 years older than he was. Fortunately, his brother got married 2 years after that. And then his sister finally got a boyfriend and we were able to get married. As a matter of fact, we were married before she was married, which was very fortunate. Otherwise, I'd be an old maid today. That would be sad. You'd be no place around, Peter. And certainly no way to take my picture and let me tell you the story of my life. My mother-in-law, as I told you, would go to Europe every 3 months to see Evelyn, who was at this clinic. Chick was born 11 months after I was married, and she was not quite a year old yet when my mother-in-law was going to Europe. And Oscar worked with his father and his brother in the fur business, and all summer long they were very, very busy because women wore fur coats and furs all winter then. And everybody had a fur coat, or a fur collar, or a fur muff, or a fur something. And they had a very prosperous business. And so I decided that I would like to go to Europe. And my mother-in-law said she'd be delighted to have me. But what about the baby? I said, I'm not going to leave the baby home. I'm taking the baby. So we ordered special milk for the baby to have on the ship. Then we went to Paris, and we stayed there for about a week. And then we went to Lausanne, where my sister-in-law was at the clinic. And I stayed with my mother-in-law at a beautiful hotel that they had built near the clinic. And that was really an experience. I met some very interesting people from all over the world. People who had the same sort of bone diseases, who came there for cures. Every bed had an ermine coverlet and magnificent nightgowns and pajamas these people wore. And they came with their maids and their butlers and whatnot. they had their beds pushed into the dining room, and they played bridge with a great big table for the 4 beds. The most startling things I ever saw were done there. I used to take the baby in a carriage in the morning to the gardens of this beautiful hotel, and I would put Chick down with her pail and her shovel, and she would fill up one pail, empty it, fill up another one, and empty it. It was a procedure that she did every single day. She was a year old, a year and 2 or 3 months old then. And one day I was sitting on the bench watching and also knitting when I looked up and I saw this entourage of quite short men, and a great number of them, and they were followed by ladies, also not too tall, but dressed in beautiful saris of exquisite materials, and I was admiring them when suddenly I realized that the man up front, and the men were dressed in morning coats and striped trousers. Anyway, Chick was sitting at the foot of the steps, pouring her usual gravel into the pail, when suddenly I looked up and I saw the first man, or one of the first group of men, bend down and pick her up and kiss her on her forehead. And I was indignant that a strange little man should behave that way to my child. Why, I don't know. So I put my knitting down, and I was about to stand up when the gardener tapped me on the shoulder and said, "C'est le roi de Siam," which was the king of Siam. And I thought to myself, how was I going to rebuke a king? It seemed impossible. But he had put her down by then, and as the men and the women went up the steps, they each patted her on her head. And I think my great fear was that they were going to take her away or somehow kidnap her. Anyway, I read in the paper that the king of Siam was in Switzerland, was in Montreux, and that he was leaving for America the next day to have an eye operation. He had cataracts. And when I received a letter from Oscar, he said, "I read in the paper that somebody like the king of Siam was at your hotel. Did you see him?" Anyway, that seemed to be very funny at the time. So it became sort of a little legend in our house that Chick was kissed by the king of Siam. And I'll derail for a few minutes and tell the story about when Chick was 8 at the public school, and they had Parents Teachers Day, and I went to see her teacher, and her teacher said to me, "Oh, you're Audrey's mother." And I said, "Yes." She said, "I must tell you, she has the most marvelous imagination." And I thought, I've never seen it displayed. Chick was so down to earth all the time. And I said, "She has?" And the teacher said, "Yes. She wrote a little story the other day, and she said that the king of Siam kissed her, or that she was kissed by the king of Siam." And she said, "Where in the world would a child think up such a story?" I said, "It happens to be true." Unbelievable, but true. And so it came about that Chick was kissed by the king of Siam. Audrey, Peter, and Eric. There were 3 children in our lives. All of them so well loved and so well taken care of, if I must say so myself. We had very bad times, many times. But The children never failed to have everything they needed, and they had a very ambitious mother, and she was not going to permit them anything but good health and a good education, no matter what. And whatever the difficulties were, and whenever they occurred, I had to find ways and means that my hopes and my dreams would not be shattered, because I wanted each of them to become a real person, someone who would be worthy of being called a good human being, a well-educated human being. And so they were. Despite all the difficulties, my ambitions, my dreams, my desires for them all came true. They are respectable and successful people, and I'm proud of them. They had good guidance with their father. They could ask him something and he would never say no or yes. He would say, if it was something he had to say no to, he would say, I would like to think about it. Let's not rush into anything. Let me think about it. Whereas they came to me, and if there was any question or doubt that it wasn't the kind of thing that was satisfactory at the moment, I would say no. There was absolutely no doubt in my mind that it was no. So just, can I go skating? And I would say, no, you can't. It's getting too dark. And if they went to their father, he would say, well, it's getting dark, but maybe I'll take you. And that was the difference. And I know he loved them. They loved him. And he was a just man, a kind man. Shut it off for a minute. Such as Eric getting married, a very, very magnificent, beautiful wedding. Eric always had lots of friends. 18 of his friends from New Jersey came to his wedding, and some of them were ushers, but his father was his best man. And when Susan was married, she wanted her grandfather to be best man, but Terry, who was to be her husband, had a brother, and he didn't think it was fair to his brother. But Susan wouldn't get married unless her grandfather was in the wedding party. So he was an usher. And I laughed all through that ceremony because I couldn't believe that anybody his age would be an usher. However, he was very pleased, and of course I was too. So there has been a lot of gratification in having the kind of children we had and the love that we got in return for what we gave. I'm not sorry one bit about that, because we've had wonderful grandchildren. And lots of love. I've reached an age when thoughts of death are most always with me. I am not fearful of it, only of the form it will take. I pray that it will be quick and easy. I would love to have my ashes scattered by the wind to as many flower beds as possible, but I am afraid of fire, and I cannot give my old bones to something I hate. So I will be buried in the earth I have loved, and hope that with me will go my faults, my weaknesses, and any prejudices I have felt towards my fellow men. Should you wish to remember me, do it with a good deed or a kind word to someone who needs you. Think of me and laugh at a happy, pleasant memory. Should all this come to pass, I will live forever.